The rain had been threatening all evening, hanging over Redding like a bruise that wouldn't quite bloom. Highway 41 cut through the Northern California landscape like a scar, and the Sunset Ridge Diner sat at its edge like a tired sentinel, its neon sign flickering against the gathering dark. The letters buzzed and hummed, casting pink and blue shadows across the gravel parking lot where a handful of vehicles sat scattered like forgotten toys. Big rigs with their engines ticking as they cooled, a couple of dusty pickups, and one silver sedan that had been there far too long for someone who'd barely touched their food. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, frying bacon, and the particular loneliness that only roadside diners seemed to collect in their vinyl booths and scuffed linoleum floors. The jukebox in the corner played soft country music that nobody listened to, and the overhead lights cast everything in a harsh fluorescent glow that made tired people look exhausted and exhausted people look half dead. Maya Reeves had worked the late shift for 3 years now, long enough to read the room without looking up from her order pad. She knew the truckers by their rigs, the regulars by their usual seats, and the dangerous ones by the way they watched. At 28, she'd learned to navigate the peculiar ecosystem of late-night diners, how to deflect unwanted advances with a smile that didn't encourage, how to maximize tips without promising anything, how to make small talk that filled silence without creating intimacy. Tonight she'd clocked the man in the window booth the moment he walked in, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because of the deliberate stillness in him, the way his eyes followed her with the patience of something that had already decided how the night would end. He wasn't the usual type who caused trouble. Those men were easy to spot. Loud, drunk, handsy, their intentions written all over their faces. No, this one was different. Clean-cut, maybe 35, wearing a button-down shirt and khakis like he'd just come from an office job. Pleasant features, the kind of face that made people trust him instinctively. But his eyes were wrong. Too focused, too patient, too certain. He'd been nursing the same cup of coffee for 40 minutes, untouched food growing cold on his plate, a burger and fries that had cost him $12 and hadn't warranted a single bite. Every time Maya moved through the dining room, refilling coffee, delivering checks, clearing plates, she felt his gaze like fingers trailing up her spine. She'd served enough men to know the difference between appreciation and ownership, and this man looked at her like she was already his, like it was only a matter of time before she understood that too. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, the dinner rush long past and the late-night crowd not yet arrived. A couple of truckers occupied the back corner booth, lost in their phones, occasionally grunting at each other in the abbreviated language of men who'd driven too many miles to waste energy on full sentences. Old Pete sat at the counter like he did every Thursday, working through his chicken-fried steak with methodical precision, his weathered hands steady as he cut each bite into identical squares before eating them in order from left to right. Maya had once asked him why he always came on Thursdays, and he'd looked at her like she'd asked why the sun came up. Because that's when you came, was all he'd said, as if his entire week was structured around this single meal in this single place. And then there was the other one, the man who'd walked in an hour ago and taken the counter seat closest to the kitchen, ordering black coffee and nothing else. He'd said it without looking at the menu, without hesitation, like he knew exactly what he wanted and had no interest in anything else the diner had to offer. He wore a leather vest that told a story even before you read the patches, Hell's Angels MC, Redding Chapter, and a bottom rocker that said California in bold letters that arched across his broad back. His name was stitched above the club insignia in red thread, Cade. The vest was worn but well-maintained, the leather soft with age and wear, decorated with other patches that Maya didn't entirely understand, but that seemed to carry weight. Years of service, positions held, roads traveled. Cade was broad-shouldered and weathered, somewhere in his early 40s with dark hair shot through with silver and hands that looked like they'd broken things and built things in equal measure. Knuckles scarred, fingers thick and capable, nails clean despite the motor oil that seemed permanently embedded in the creases of his palms. A thick beard framed a face that was hard to read. Not cruel, but not particularly warm either. He had the kind of presence that changed the temperature of a room just by being in it, the way a wolf changes the energy in a forest even when it's just standing still. Maya had served enough bikers to know not all of them were the same. Some were weekend warriors playing dress-up, accountants and lawyers who stored their leathers in climate-controlled closets and only took their bikes out on sunny Sundays. Others were the real thing, Men who lived by codes older and stricter than any law written in a courtroom, who'd earned their patches through loyalty and sacrifice and things they'd never talk about to civilians. Cade struck her as the latter. He hadn't said much beyond his order, but she'd noticed the way his eyes tracked the room with the alertness of someone who'd learned young that comfort was a luxury and vigilance was survival. She'd also noticed that every time the man in the window booth stared at her, Cade's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath his beard. It was past 10 when the tension finally crystallized into something she couldn't ignore. The truckers had paid and left, rumbling out of the parking lot with a hiss of air brakes and the low growl of diesel engines. Old Pete had shuffled off 15 minutes ago, leaving his usual $3 tip folded neatly under his water glass. The cook had already left for the night, leaving Maya to handle the closing routine alone, something she'd done 100 times but that tonight felt different, weighted with unnamed dread. Maya approached Cade's seat to refill his coffee, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the pot. The glass was hot in her palm, the coffee inside still steaming, and she had to concentrate to keep it steady. She leaned in just enough that her words wouldn't carry, her voice barely above a whisper, her lips barely moving. "He's following me." She didn't look at the window booth as she said it, keeping her eyes on the coffee cup, on the dark liquid rising toward the rim, on anything except the man whose gaze she could feel burning into her back. But she didn't need to look. She knew exactly where he was, what he was doing, how he was watching her even now, probably enjoying the fact that she was scared, that she'd been forced to ask for help. Cade's eyes flicked past her, landing on the man with the precision of a blade finding its sheath. For a moment he said nothing. The only sound was the soft hiss of fresh coffee hitting the bottom of his cup, the faint sizzle where a drop had escaped and hit the hot plate of the coffee maker, the distant hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Then, without urgency or theatrics, Cade set down his mug. His leather-gloved hand rested on the counter between them, solid and deliberate, fingers splayed across the worn formica like he was claiming territory. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that she had to strain to hear it, a rumble that came from deep in his chest. "How long?" "3 nights," Maya breathed, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Different times, but always when I'm closing. He sits in his car across the lot until I leave. Just sits there, watching. Last night he was there until almost 2 in the morning. Tonight he came inside." Cade's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. A coiling, a gathering of intent, like a spring being compressed. He turned his head slowly, deliberately, until his gaze locked onto the man in the booth. The air between them seemed to sharpen, charged with an unspoken challenge, and Maya watched the man's smile falter just slightly, uncertainty flickering across his pleasant features before the mask settled back into place. The man in the booth smiled wider. It was a patient smile, confident, the smile of someone who believed he had all the time in the world, who'd played this game before and always won eventually. He raised his coffee cup in a small salute, acknowledging Cade's attention with the kind of arrogance that came from never having been truly challenged. "Go back to the kitchen," Cade said quietly, his eyes never leaving the other man. "Stay there until I come get you." Maya's throat tightened. "What are you—" "Kitchen, Maya." His tone didn't rise, but the authority in it was absolute. The kind of command that didn't expect to be questioned because it came from someone who'd spent a lifetime being obeyed. Now, her knees felt weak, and not entirely from fear. There was something in the way he said her name, like he'd claimed it, like in that moment she belonged to the protection he was offering, and there was no room for negotiation or debate. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really a command. It was simply a statement of how things were going to be, delivered with the kind of certainty that made arguing seem absurd. Maya nodded once, her mouth too dry to speak, and moved toward the kitchen, her pulse hammering in her ears. Behind the swinging door, she pressed her back against the wall, trying to steady her breathing, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them still. Through the small circular window in the door, she could see Cade rising from his stool with unhurried certainty, unfolding himself with the controlled grace of someone who'd been in more fights than he could count, and had learned that speed was less important than inevitability. He didn't storm across the room. He didn't shout or posture or make a show of his intentions. He simply walked toward the window booth with the inevitability of weather, of seasons changing, of night following day, and every eye in the diner, the few that remained, turned to watch. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, The man in the booth looked up as Cade approached, his smile widening slightly, like he'd been expecting this, like it was all part of some script he'd written in his head where he came out on top. He was younger than Cade, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that made people trust him instinctively. Button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed khakis, a leather belt with a simple silver buckle, brown loafers that looked expensive but not ostentatious, pleasant features, symmetrical and unremarkable, the kind of face that disappeared in a crowd unless you were looking for it, the kind of man who could talk his way into anywhere, who understood that predators who looked like monsters rarely caught anything worth keeping. "Evening," the man said pleasantly, leaning back in the booth with the easy confidence of someone who'd never really been hurt, never really been afraid. "Something I can help you with?" Cade stopped at the edge of the table, his presence filling the space like smoke filling a room, like water rising, inexorable and inescapable. He didn't sit. He didn't lean in. He didn't raise his voice or make threats. He just stood there looking down at the man with eyes that had gone flat and cold, the kind of eyes that had seen things this clean-cut office worker couldn't even imagine. "You're leaving," Cade said. Not a question, not a suggestion, a simple statement of fact, delivered in the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather. The man's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe. Or the beginning of irritation. "I'm just finishing my coffee. Free country, isn't it?" "Not anymore." Cade's voice remained level, almost conversational. But there was an edge to it now. Something sharp hidden in velvet. "Not for you. Not here." That's a bold claim. The man tilted his head, studying Cade like he was trying to decide whether to be amused or offended. Like he couldn't quite figure out if this biker was serious, or just making a show for the waitress. "You the owner?" "Because I don't see a problem. I paid for my meal. I'm sitting here quietly. Seems to me I'm within my rights." Cade reached down and picked up the man's coffee cup, still half full, the ceramic warm in his hand. He held it for a moment, weighing it, considering it, and then walked to the nearest trash can, a battered metal cylinder by the front door, and dumped it out, the liquid splashing loudly against the garbage, the sound seeming to echo in the sudden quiet of the diner. The few remaining customers, a young couple in a far booth who'd been too absorbed in each other to notice the tension, looked up sharply, suddenly aware that something was happening. When Cade returned to the booth, he set the empty cup down in front of the man with deliberate precision, centering it exactly on the saucer with a soft clink that sounded final, absolute. "Coffee's finished," Cade said. "Time to go." The pleasant mask cracked just slightly. The man's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, and for the first time Maya, watching from the kitchen with her heart in her throat, saw something ugly flash across his features. "You're making a mistake, friend." "No," Cade said softly, and the quietness of his voice was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "You made the mistake. 3 nights ago when you started stalking that woman, when you sat in your car in the dark watching her walk to her vehicle, watching her drive away, probably following her home to learn where she lived. Tonight, when you walked through that door thinking you had any right to her fear, any claim to her attention just because you decided you wanted it. I don't know what she told you, but doesn't matter what she told me." Cade's voice dropped lower, and suddenly there was something coiled and dangerous in it, something that made the temperature in the diner drop several degrees. "You think I didn't see you? You think I don't know exactly what you are? I've met 100 men like you. The kind who think patience is the same as permission. The kind who believe if you wait long enough, watch long enough, make yourself present enough, you'll wear her down. That eventually she'll see your persistence as devotion instead of what it really is. Violation." The man's face flushed, color rising in his cheeks and his hands clenched into fists on the table. "You can't just—" "I can." Cade leaned forward now, just enough that his shadow fell across the booth, just enough that the man had to look up at him, had to acknowledge the physical disadvantage he was in. "And I will. You're going to stand up. You're going to walk out that door. And you're never going to come within 100 yards of this diner again. You're never going to drive past when she's working. Never going to wait in the parking lot, never going to sit in your car in the dark watching her windows, never going to so much as think her name without remembering this moment." "Or what?" The man's voice had gone thin, the bravado cracking like cheap paint over rust. "You going to beat me up? That's assault, friend. I could have you arrested. I could sue you. I have rights." Cade smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. It was the kind of smile that made people step back instinctively. that activated ancient prey responses buried deep in the human brainstem. You could try, but here's what would happen. You'd call the cops, they'd come down, take statements from everyone here, and I'd tell them about how you've been stalking my waitress for 3 nights, how you followed her to work, sat in your car watching her, made her afraid to walk to her vehicle alone. We'd pull the security footage. Yeah, this place has cameras, you didn't notice them. And we'd show them you sitting out there in the dark, hour after hour. The angle's perfect, catches your license plate and everything. The color drained from the man's face like water circling a drain. Then they'd run your name, Cade continued, his voice still that same deadly calm, each word dropping like a stone into still water. And we'd find out this isn't the first time, is it? There's always a history with men like you. Maybe a restraining order from an ex-girlfriend who got scared enough to involve the courts. Maybe a complaint from a coworker that HR swept under the rug. Maybe just a reputation in your neighborhood. Whispers about the guy who stares too long, who shows up in too many places by coincidence. Something. There's always something. The man opened his mouth, then closed it, his face now completely white. So you go ahead and call the cops if you want, Cade said, straightening up, creating distance again but somehow making the threat feel larger, not smaller. Or you can walk out now, get in your car and drive away from Reading. Not just away from this diner, away from this town entirely. You can find another place to live your life. Bother some other woman who'll have to learn to be afraid of you. Your choice. But if you choose wrong, if I see you here again, if I hear you've gone near her, if you so much as drive down this highway, he paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the man's imagination fill in the blanks. Well, the law's only useful if you're alive to call it. It wasn't a threat, not really. It was a promise, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd kept such promises before, who knew exactly how far he was willing to go, and had made peace with it long ago. The man stared at Cade for a long moment, his jaw working, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his breath coming faster. Maya watched him calculate, watched him measure Cade against himself and find the equation didn't balance in his favor, watched the exact moment when his nerve broke. Then, slowly, he slid out of the booth and stood. He was taller than Cade had expected, maybe 6'2", but it didn't matter. Height meant nothing against the kind of presence Cade carried, against the kind of violence he clearly knew intimately. This isn't over, the man muttered, but there was no conviction in it, just the last gasp of wounded pride. Yes, Cade said quietly. Finally, it is. They stood there, locked in a silent confrontation that lasted maybe 5 seconds but felt like an hour, and then the man broke. He grabbed his jacket from the booth, threw a 20 on the table. Too much for what he'd ordered, but he clearly didn't care about change, just wanted out, and walked toward the door with quick, angry steps that tried to look purposeful, but just looked like retreat. The bell above the door chimed as he left, cheerful and incongruous, and through the window, they watched him climb into the silver sedan Maya had been dreading for 3 nights. He peeled out of the parking lot with unnecessary speed, gravel spraying, tires squealing slightly on the asphalt, and then he was gone, taillights disappearing into the darkness like red eyes blinking out. The diner let out a collective breath. The young couple in the corner booth looked at each other with wide eyes, then quickly dropped money on their table and left, clearly not wanting to be involved in whatever this was. The night manager, a tired woman named Sarah who usually stayed in the back office doing paperwork, poked her head out, looked around, seemed to assess that no one was bleeding or dead, and retreated again without comment. Cade turned and walked back toward the kitchen, pushing through the swinging door without hesitation, without asking permission. Maya was exactly where he'd told her to be, pressed against the wall near the walk-in freezer, her eyes wide and her breathing shallow, her hands still clasped together to hide their trembling. When she saw him, something in her face crumbled, relief, gratitude, and something else she couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerous and necessary all at once. He's gone, Cade said simply, his voice gentler now, the hard edge gone. Maya nodded, but she couldn't seem to find words. Her throat was too tight, her chest too full of things she didn't know how to express. Her hands were shaking, and even clasping them together couldn't hide it anymore. Cade noticed. He noticed everything. You all right? His voice had gentled further, but the authority in it remained, the sense that he expected an honest answer. She swallowed hard, tried again. Yeah, thank you. I don't know what I would have. You don't need to thank me. He stepped closer and suddenly the kitchen felt smaller, warmer. The air between them charged with something electric. But you need to understand something. Men like that, they don't stop because you ask nicely. They don't respect boundaries unless someone makes them. They don't care about your fear, they feed on it, it makes them feel powerful. I know. Her voice came out as a whisper. Do you? Cade's eyes searched hers and she felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze, like he was reading her, seeing past all her defenses to the scared, tired woman underneath. Because you didn't tell anyone until tonight. You didn't call the police. You didn't ask for help from your manager or your coworkers. You just kept working, kept hoping he'd lose interest, kept minimizing what was happening because women are taught to be polite, to not make a fuss, to handle things themselves. She looked away, shame heating her cheeks. I didn't want to make a scene. I thought maybe I was overreacting, that if I just ignored him, he'd eventually give up and move on to. She stopped, realizing what she'd been about to say. To someone else? Cade finished for her. Someone who maybe wouldn't be so lucky to have a biker sitting at the counter when she finally got scared enough to ask for help. Maya's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. I didn't know what else to do. You did exactly right, Cade said, and the approval in his voice made something warm bloom in her chest. Tonight, when you told me, that took guts. That was smart, but you don't get to do that anymore. Wait until it's almost too late. You don't get to minimize your fear or convince yourself it's nothing or worry about being polite to men who don't deserve your politeness. When something feels wrong, it is wrong. You understand me? Maya's breath caught. There was something overwhelming about having his full attention, about being the focus of all that intensity, all that certainty. Yes, good. He held her gaze for another long moment, then stepped back, giving her space to breathe. But somehow the distance didn't make her feel less connected to him. I'm going to wait until you close up. Then I'm going to follow you home. Make sure he's not waiting somewhere down the road. Make sure he didn't just drive around the block and come back. Make sure you get inside safely. You don't have to. Not a negotiation, Maya. That tone again, the one that didn't leave room for argument, the one that made her spine straighten and her pulse quicken. Get back to work. Finish your closing. I'll be at the counter. The rest of the shift passed in a strange, heightened awareness. Maya moved through her closing routine, wiping down tables with practiced efficiency, counting the register twice to make sure she hadn't made any mistakes, mopping the floors in long, methodical strokes that left streaks of lamplight on the wet linoleum. But she was constantly aware of Cade's presence at the counter. He'd ordered another coffee and sat there like a sentinel, his eyes tracking every car that pulled into the lot, every shadow that moved past the windows, every sound from the parking lot. The young couple had left right after the confrontation, practically running to their car. The night manager, Sarah, had emerged from the office around 11, given Cade a long, appraising look, then nodded at Maya, and left through the back door without saying anything. Maya appreciated that Sarah seemed to understand something had happened, and that Cade was now part of whatever it was, that his presence was protection rather than threat. By the time Maya finished mopping, it was nearly midnight. The diner was empty except for the two of them, the lights harsh and exposing, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of trucks on Highway 41. She felt exhausted, wrung out, like she'd been holding herself tense for hours and had only just realized it. You need help with anything? Cade asked as Maya locked the front door, his voice breaking the silence. Just the trash, she admitted, gesturing to the 2 large bags she'd collected from the bins. I usually take it out back before I leave. Sarah always says not to leave it for the morning shift. I'll do it. You really don't? But he was already picking up the bags, his movements economical and certain, like this was just another task that needed doing, and there was no point in discussing it further. Maya watched him push through the back door into the alley, and she found herself following, unable to stay inside alone even though the danger had supposedly passed. The stalker was gone, driven away by Cade's threat, but she still felt vulnerable, exposed like safety was only real when she could see Cade, when she was near him. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the smell of rain that still hadn't fallen, just kept threatening, kept building in the clouds overhead. The alley behind the diner was narrow and dark, hemmed in by brick walls on both sides, illuminated only by a single yellow security light that buzzed with dying bulbs and cast everything in a sickly, uneven glow. Puddles from earlier rain reflected the light back in broken fragments. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound lonely and insistent. Cade heaved the trash bags into the dumpster with practiced ease, the metal lid clanging as he let it fall back into place, and then he turned to find Maya standing in the doorway, hugging herself against the chill, her thin work shirt insufficient against the cooling night. "Cold?" he asked. "A little." He shrugged out of his leather vest without hesitation and held it out to her, his t-shirt underneath stretched across broad shoulders and a solid chest. "Here." Maya hesitated. There was something intimate about wearing his vest, about wrapping herself in leather that still carried his warmth, his scent. In the motorcycle world, she knew, a club vest was sacred. You didn't let just anyone wear it, didn't let it out of your sight. For him to offer it to her felt significant, weighted with meaning she wasn't sure she understood, but that made her heart beat faster. But the cold won out, and she took it, slipping it over her shoulders. It was heavy, much heavier than she'd expected, and it smelled like leather and motor oil and something distinctly masculine, something that made her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. The weight of it felt like armor, like protection, like being claimed. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Cade's expression was unreadable in the dim light, his face half in shadow. "Nothing good. Have you done that before? Dealt with men like him?" "More times than I care to count." He leaned against the brick wall, his arms crossed over his chest, and even in casual repose there was something coiled about him, something ready. Worlds full of predators. Most of them don't look like monsters. They look like everyone else, and that's what makes them dangerous. They look like the nice guy at the office, the helpful neighbor, the polite customer. By the time you realize what they are, they've already gotten close. "Is that why you noticed when he came in tonight?" "I noticed because I pay attention, because I've learned that the most dangerous moment is when everyone else thinks everything's fine." He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes reflecting the yellow security light. "You handled yourself well, telling me. That took guts. Most people freeze up, convince themselves they're imagining things until it's too late. I was terrified. Terror and courage aren't opposites. One doesn't cancel out the other." His voice softened slightly, just a fraction, but enough that she felt it like a physical touch. "You felt fear, and you acted anyway. That's what courage is. You did good, Maya." Hearing him say it made something warm bloom in her chest, something that felt dangerous in its own right because it made her want more. More approval, more protection, more of whatever this was between them. She pulled his vest tighter around her shoulders, her fingers finding the patches, tracing the embroidered letters without thinking about it. "What happens now?" she asked. "If he comes back?" "He won't." "How can you be sure?" "Because men like that are cowards. They only pick fights they think they can win, targets they think are vulnerable. And he knows now that coming near you means going through me." Cade pushed off the wall and moved closer, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to look at him, until she could feel the heat coming off his body. "But if he's stupid enough to try, if he's got more pride than sense, you call me. Immediately. You don't wait, you don't second-guess yourself, you don't worry about bothering me or whether it's really an emergency. You just call." He pulled out his phone, and Maya did the same with trembling fingers, her hands still not entirely steady. They exchanged numbers in the quiet of the alley, the simple transaction feeling weighted with significance, like they were signing a contract neither of them had fully read. When his number appeared on her screen, just Cade, no last name, no designation, she felt like she'd been given something valuable and dangerous all at once, like she was now connected to him in a way that went beyond tonight, beyond this moment. "Come on," he said, pocketing his phone. "Let's get you home." Maya locked up the diner with keys that rattled in her nervous hands, double-checking the lock like she did every night, and then followed Cade to the parking lot. She'd assumed he'd follow her in his bike while she drove her car, maintaining a protective distance behind her. But instead he walked past her beat-up Honda without a glance and gestured to a massive motorcycle parked near the door. A Harley-Davidson with chrome that gleamed even in the dim light, all black and silver and dangerous beauty. "Leave your car here tonight," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. "I'll bring you back in the morning to get it. I can drive myself." "Not negotiating, remember?" He held out a helmet, and there was something in his eyes that made her throat go dry. Something possessive and protective all tangled together. Besides, you're shaking. Your adrenaline's still crashing. You shouldn't be driving when you can barely hold your keys steady. He was right. Her hands were trembling, and the thought of driving the dark roads home alone, constantly checking her rearview mirror for silver sedans, constantly wondering if every pair of headlights belonged to him, made her stomach clench with renewed fear. She took the helmet. Cade helped her adjust the straps with surprisingly gentle hands, his fingers efficient and impersonal against her throat, and she found herself watching his face as he worked, the concentration in his eyes, the way his beard moved when he frowned slightly, checking that everything was secure. When he was satisfied, he swung onto the bike with the ease of long practice, the machine settling under his weight like it was an extension of his body. "Get on behind me," he instructed, his voice taking on that commanding tone again. "Arms around my waist, hold on tight. When I lean, you lean with me. Don't fight the movement. Don't try to stay upright when the bike tilts. Just trust me and move with it." Maya climbed on awkwardly, her legs spreading to accommodate the width of the machine, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how intimate this position was, her thighs pressed against his, her chest against his back, her arms wrapping around his solid waist. When she locked her hands together at his stomach, she could feel the muscles there, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, could smell leather and rain and something darker, more elemental. "Where to?" he asked over his shoulder. She gave him her address, a small rental house on the east side of Reading, nothing fancy but hers, a place she'd been proud of when she signed the lease 3 years ago. And then the engine roared to life beneath them, a deep, throaty growl that vibrated through her entire body, thrumming in her chest and her stomach and lower. Cade pulled out of the parking lot with controlled power, not showing off but not holding back either, and suddenly they were moving through the night, the wind rushing past them, the world reduced to speed and darkness, and the solid warmth of his body against hers. Maya held on tighter than she needed to, her cheek pressed against his back, her eyes half closed against the wind, and for the first time all night, she felt safe. Not just protected, but safe, like nothing could touch her as long as she was holding on to him, like the world couldn't reach her here, pressed against his broad back with his strength between her and everything else. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, the kind that made women do foolish things, trust too much, want what they shouldn't, the kind that made smart, independent women hand over pieces of themselves to men who might not give them back. But tonight, racing through the dark streets of Reading with a Hell's Angel who'd threatened violence on her behalf, Maya let herself have it, let herself feel small and protected instead of constantly strong, let herself lean on someone instead of always standing alone. The ride was over too soon. Cade pulled up in front of her house, a modest single story with a small yard and a porch light she'd left on, and killed the engine, the sudden silence almost shocking after the constant rumble. Maya dismounted clumsily, her legs unsteady, weak from adrenaline and relief and something else she didn't want to name, and handed him back the helmet with hands that still trembled slightly. He took it but made no move to leave, his eyes scanning her house, the street, the shadows between the neighboring homes with the same alertness he'd shown in the diner. "Lights on inside?" he asked. "I left the porch light on, and the one in the living room. I always do when I work late." "Good. Go in, lock the door behind you, check all your windows before you go to bed. Make sure they're all locked, every single one. Text me when you're secure, when you've checked everything and you're ready to sleep." "Cade." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity of it made her breath catch in her throat. This isn't over just because he drove away tonight. Men like that, they stew. They replay the confrontation in their heads, edit it until they're the victim and I'm the bad guy and you're the ungrateful bitch who should have been flattered by his attention. They convince themselves they have a right to revenge, to teaching you a lesson. So you're careful, you hear me? You don't open your door unless you know who it is. You park under lights. You vary your schedule if you can. And if anything feels off, anything at all, if you see his car, if you see him, if you just get that feeling that something's wrong, you call me first. Not 911, not your friends, not your manager. Me. Why? The question slipped out before she could stop it, raw and honest. Why do you care so much? You don't even know me. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. Pain, maybe, or memory, or regret. Because someone should, he said finally, his voice rough. Because too many women learn the hard way that no one's coming to help, that they're on their own, that the world doesn't care if they're scared or hurt or dead. And because, he paused, his jaw tightening, because I can't stand by and watch when I have the power to do something about it, because I've stood by before when I was younger, when I didn't understand what silence cost, and I won't do it again. There was history in those words, old wounds that hadn't quite healed, and Maya wanted to ask, wanted to know what had happened to make him this way, but it didn't feel like the right time, didn't feel like something he'd share in a dark street at midnight with a woman he barely knew. It wasn't quite an answer, but it was all she was going to get tonight. Maya nodded, and then, acting on impulse, on gratitude, on something deeper and more dangerous, she stepped forward and kissed his cheek. Just a brief press of lips against beard-roughened skin. There and gone in a heartbeat, but Cade went absolutely still, every muscle in his body freezing like she'd done something shocking, something forbidden. "Thank you," she whispered against his skin, her lips moving against his beard. "For everything." When she pulled back, his eyes had darkened, his expression unreadable but intense, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her, might close the distance between them and kiss her properly, might pull her against him and, "Get inside, Maya." His voice was rough, strained, like he was fighting something. "Now," she went, her heart hammering, his vest still draped over her shoulders because she'd forgotten to give it back and he hadn't asked for it. At her door, she fumbled with her keys, dropped them once and had to bend down to pick them up, her hands shaking too badly to manage the simple task. When she finally got the door open and turned back to wave, to thank him one more time, he was already watching, already waiting to see her safely inside, his eyes tracking her every movement. When the door closed and the lock clicked home, she heard the motorcycle roar back to life, heard it fade into the distance as Cade disappeared into the night, leaving her alone in her small house, with her racing heart and his leather vest, and the memory of how solid he'd felt against her, how safe she'd felt in his protection. Maya leaned against the door, her fingers touching her lips where she'd kissed him, and wondered what the hell she'd just started, what chain of events she'd set in motion by whispering those 3 words, "He's following me," to a stranger in a diner. Maya barely slept. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every car passing outside had her peering through the blinds with her heart in her throat. Every shadow seemed to take the shape of a man standing in her yard, watching, waiting. She kept her phone on the nightstand, Cade's number pulled up and ready to dial with just one touch, but the night passed without incident. No silver sedan cruising slowly past her house, no rocks thrown at her windows, no shadows at her doors, no patient stalker finally losing patience and deciding to take what he wanted. By the time dawn broke gray and reluctant over Reading, painting her bedroom walls in shades of slate and ash, Maya had made coffee and paced her kitchen approximately 500 times, still wearing Cade's vest because it felt like armor and comfort all at once because it smelled like him, and that made her feel less alone. She'd tried to sleep around 3, had lain in her bed staring at the ceiling for an hour before giving up and getting up again, her mind too full of replays, the stalker's patient smile, Cade's flat, cold eyes, the way he'd dumped out the coffee like it was a declaration of war, the rumble of his motorcycle between her thighs. When her phone buzzed at 7 a.m., she nearly dropped her coffee mug. The notification lit up her screen, and she grabbed for it with shaking hands. "You up?" The text was from Cade. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed back, "Yes. Couldn't sleep. Nightmares? No, just jumpy. Every sound. Normal. Adrenaline crash. Should get better tonight." There was a pause, 3 dots appearing and disappearing as he typed something, deleted it, typed again. Finally, "I'll be there in 20 to take you to your car. You don't have to." 20 minutes, Maya. Not a negotiation. Never a negotiation with him. She found she didn't mind as much as she probably should have, found that there was something comforting in his certainty, in the way he took charge of things, in not having to make every decision herself. She scrambled to shower and change, the hot water helping ease some of the tension from her shoulders, though her muscles still ached from being clenched tight all night. She pulled on jeans and a clean t-shirt, nothing special, and caught sight of herself in the mirror, shadows under her eyes, her face pale, her hair still damp and curling at the ends. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd spent the night jumping at shadows, but she also looked different somehow, changed, like something fundamental had shifted in her last night when she'd whispered for help. And help had come in the form of a man in leather and denim who'd threatened violence with the casualness of someone discussing the weather. She was brushing her teeth when she heard the rumble of his motorcycle announcing his arrival exactly 20 minutes later, the sound making her stomach flip with something that wasn't fear. She grabbed his vest from where she'd folded it carefully on her bed, trying to smooth out the wrinkles from where she'd slept curled around it like a security blanket, and headed outside. The morning was cool and misty, the rain still threatening but holding off, the sky heavy with clouds that looked bruised and swollen. Cade looked like he hadn't slept either, his eyes shadowed but alert, his jaw tight with tension that suggested he'd spent the night the same way she had, hyper-vigilant, waiting for something to go wrong. When she approached with his vest, he took it, but his eyes lingered on her face, cataloging every detail with the same intensity he'd shown in the diner. "You check your house? All the windows?" "Yes, 3 times. Everything's locked up tight. No signs anyone tried to get in." "Good." He helped her with the helmet again, and this time when she climbed onto the bike behind him it felt familiar, like something they'd been doing for years instead of hours, like her body remembered exactly how to fit against his, where to put her hands, how to hold on. Her arms went around his waist naturally, and when he started the engine, she let herself relax against him, let herself trust that he knew where they were going and how to get there safely. The ride to the diner took 15 minutes through early morning streets that were mostly empty, Redding still waking up, stretching, yawning into consciousness, coffee shops just opening their doors, a few early risers walking dogs or heading to jobs that started before the sun was properly up, cars beginning to populate the roads as the city slowly came to life. The mist made everything look soft and unreal, like they were riding through a dream. When they pulled into the diner's parking lot, Maya's car sat exactly where she'd left it, her beat-up Honda with the dent in the passenger door and the rust creeping up from the wheel wells, ordinary and unchanged and somehow precious because it was hers, and it was untouched. Relief flooded through her that it hadn't been vandalized, that he hadn't come back to slash her tires or scratch threats into her paint as some kind of revenge for being rejected. But Cade didn't let her dismount immediately. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, his hand coming down to cover hers where they were clasped at his waist, his palm warm and rough and solid over her knuckles. "Listen to me," he said quietly, and even without the engine's rumble his voice carried authority. "What happened last night? It changes things. He knows now that you're not alone, that someone's looking out for you. That's good. That'll make him think twice. But it's also complicated." Maya's stomach clenched with fresh anxiety. "Why?" "Because now he has a face to attach to his resentment, and that face is mine. He's not just angry at you for rejecting him anymore. He's angry at me for interfering, for making him look like a coward, for taking away something he thought was his." Cade's fingers tightened slightly on her hands. "You think he'll come after you?" "I think he'll be smart enough not to. I think he'll convince himself you're not worth the risk, that there are easier targets, women who don't have protection. But men do stupid things when their ego's bruised, when they feel humiliated, and some men would rather die than back down from a challenge." He paused, his voice hardening. "Point is, you need to stay alert. For a while, until we're sure he's really gone. You don't walk to your car alone. You don't work late shifts without someone around, me or Sarah or one of the other staff. And you keep my number on speed dial." "Okay," she breathed, meaning it, understanding that this wasn't paranoia but practical caution from someone who'd seen how badly these situations could go. "I mean it, Maya. This isn't me being overprotective or controlling. This is me knowing how these situations play out when people aren't careful, when they let their guard down too soon because they want to believe the danger's past. I understand." And she did, could hear in his voice that this came from experience, from having seen the consequences of not being careful enough. He studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face like he was looking for any sign that she wasn't taking this seriously, and then he nodded and let her dismount. She handed him back the helmet, but before he could leave, before he could kick the engine to life and ride away into the morning, she found herself speaking. "Why do I feel like I'm going to see you again?" Something that might have been a smile ghosted across his face, softening the hard lines just slightly. "Because you are. The diner makes decent coffee, and I like the counter seat. Good vantage point. Can see the whole room, back to the wall, close to the kitchen if there's trouble." "Just the coffee?" The question was bold, reckless even, but Maya was tired of playing it safe. tired of minimizing herself, tired of pretending she didn't feel the connection between them, the electricity that crackled in the air whenever they were close. Cade's eyes darkened, and for a moment she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Hunger, interest, desire, all carefully controlled but unmistakably present, like fire banked but not extinguished. Get to your car, Maya. Lock the doors. And maybe don't ask questions you're not ready to hear answered. It wasn't a rejection. It was a warning, a promise, a challenge all rolled into one, delivered in that voice that made her knees weak and her stomach tighten. Maya's pulse kicked up, her mouth going dry, and she nodded mutely before turning toward her car, feeling his eyes on her the entire way, tracking every step, cataloging every movement. She could feel his gaze like a physical touch on her back, her hips, the places where her jeans hugged her curves. It should have felt intrusive, should have made her uncomfortable, but instead, it made her feel seen, desired, claimed in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. When she climbed inside her Honda and locked the doors like he'd told her to, he waited until her engine started and caught before firing up his own bike. He followed her home again, keeping a careful distance but always there in her rearview mirror, a silent guardian in leather and chrome. When she pulled into her driveway, he idled at the curb until she was safely inside her house, until she'd locked the door behind her and texted him the single word he'd told her to send. Safe. His response came immediately. Good. I'll be by the diner tonight. Usual seat. If he shows up before then, you call me. Maya stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, trying to think of what to say, how to express the tangle of gratitude and confusion and attraction that was knotted up in her chest. Finally, she settled on simple honesty. I will. Thank you for everything. His response came after a pause, 3 dots appearing and disappearing several times before the message finally arrived. Not finished yet. See you tonight. Maya set down her phone and pressed her hand to her racing heart, feeling it hammer against her ribs. No, she thought. Not finished. This, whatever this was between them, this crackling awareness, this dangerous attraction, this feeling of being protected and possessed all at once was just beginning. She should probably be smart about this. Should keep her distance, maintain boundaries, remember that Cade was a Hell's Angel who'd threatened violence in her defense, that he lived a life completely different from hers, that getting involved would be complicated and probably foolish. He was older than her by at least a decade. He belonged to a motorcycle club with a reputation that ranged from noble to notorious depending on who you asked. He'd looked at a man last night and promised death with his eyes, and she'd believed him absolutely. But as Maya pushed away from the door and headed to her bedroom to finally get some real sleep, her body exhausted even if her mind was still racing, she couldn't shake the memory of how solid he'd felt against her on that motorcycle, how absolutely certain his commands had been, how weak her knees had gone when he'd looked at her and said her name like he owned it, like she was his to protect and his to keep and his to claim if he decided he wanted to. She was going to see him tonight, and tomorrow night, and probably every night after that until she figured out whether the danger in her life was really gone, or if she just traded one kind of risk for another, the known danger of a stalker for the unknown danger of a man who made her want things she'd never let herself want before. Safety, protection, someone else making the decisions for once, someone else being strong so she didn't have to be. Outside her window, the rain finally began to fall, soft and steady, washing the streets clean, drumming against her roof like fingers tapping out a rhythm. And somewhere in Redding, a Hell's Angel named Cade went about his day with the patient certainty of a man who'd found something worth protecting, something worth claiming, something worth whatever came next. The line had been crossed last night when Maya had whispered, "He's following me," and Cade had responded by stepping between her and danger. But another line had been crossed too, something more subtle and more dangerous, the line between protector and man she couldn't stop thinking about, between grateful and wanting, between safe and wanting to be his in ways that went far beyond simple protection. Maya climbed into bed still fully dressed, too exhausted to bother changing into pajamas, and pulled the covers up to her chin. Her last thought before sleep finally claimed her was of Cade's hand covering hers on the motorcycle, warm and solid and certain, and the way his voice had sounded when he said, "Not finished yet." She fell asleep smiling. Despite everything, despite the fear and the exhaustion and the uncertainty, because for the first time in 3 years of late-night shifts and loneliness and men who looked but never saw her, someone had actually stepped up, Someone had made her feel like she mattered, like her fear was justified, like she was worth protecting. And tonight he'd be sitting at the counter again, drinking black coffee and watching the room with those alert, knowing eyes. Tonight, and tomorrow, and for as long as it took to make sure she was truly safe. Or maybe, Maya thought as sleep pulled her under, for longer than that. Maybe for as long as she wanted him there. Maybe forever.